The brain is a complex organ that controls thought, memory, emotion, touch, motor skills, vision, breathing, temperature, hunger, and processes that regulate our body. This is the organ that makes us different from other animals. This sophisticated organ, one of the most complex structures that even human beings themselves understand less about it. The brain weighs about 1.5 kilograms and makes up about 2% of the human body weight. The cerebrospinal fluid suspends it in neutral buoyancy to a weight of about 25 grams. The brain is protected within the skull and is composed of three main parts. These are the cerebrum, cerebellum, and the brainstem. This amazing structure receives information through our five senses: the sight, smell, touch, taste, and hearing. The information is assembled in a way that has meaning to us and can store the information in our memory provided we still alive and our brain is not affected by a certain pathology. The brain forms part of the central nervous system together with the spinal cord. We said it's divided in three parts. Let's break them down. The cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, composed of our right and left hemispheres. Each hemisphere has four lobes divided by fissures. The two hemispheres of the brain are separated by the greater longitudinal fissure and joined at the bottom by the corpus callosum, and delivers messages from one half of the brain to the other. Each lobe may be divided into areas that serve very specific functions. Each lobe does not function alone. Let's begin with the frontal lobe. This is responsible for judgment, planning, problem solving, personality, behavior, emotions, speech and writing, which is carried out by this specific area called the Broca's area. Body movement, intelligence, concentration, self-awareness. Temporal lobe helps you understand language, and the specific area responsible for this function is called the Wernicke's area. It's also responsible for hearing, memory, organization, and sequencing. Parietal lobe, responsible for interpreting language, words, spatial and visual perception, sense of touch, pain, temperature, interprets signals from vision, hearing, motor and sensory functions, and memory. And lastly, the occipital, responsible for interpretation of vision information, color, light, movement. The other major part of the brain is the cerebellum, located just beneath the cerebrum. Major structure of the hindbrain and is the largest structure of the hindbrain. It makes up about 10% of the total volume of the brain, yet it contains an estimated 50% to 80% of the brain's neurons. There are two main parts of the cerebellum: cerebellar cortex, a layer containing folded tissue containing most of the cerebellum's neurons; cerebellar nuclei, the innermost part of the cerebellum containing nerve cells that communicate information from the cerebellum. What are the functions? Coordinating the body's voluntary movement, helps organize all actions of the muscle groups involved in particular movement. For example, walking, running, throwing a ball, and even eye movement. It's also responsible for mental functions. Researchers believe the cerebellum plays a role in thinking, including processing language and mood, as well as attention, fear response, and pleasure or reward response. Balance and posture is also another function. Effects of alcohol on the cerebellum can become visible when one develops ataxia or loss of coordination. Movement is impaired. Those who are intoxicated might find that they cannot even walk in a straight line or even touch their own nose as instructed. Motor learning is another function. When you learn to perform a new skill such as riding a bike or hitting a baseball, you often go through a trial and error process. As you fine-tune your motor movements, you eventually become better able to perform the skill. Eventually, you can perform the action seamlessly. So the cerebellum plays a critical role in these processes. The brainstem. This is the posterior stalk-like part of the brain that connects the cerebrum with the spinal cord, composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Makes up around 2.6% of the brain's total weight. 10 pairs of cranial nerves come from the brainstem. Three main parts of the brainstem. Let's begin with the midbrain. Is the forwardmost part of the brainstem and is associated with vision, hearing, motor control, sleep and wakefulness, arousal, and temperature regulation. In the rostral direction, the midbrain noticeably splays laterally. Let's look at the tectum. This is the dorsal side of the midbrain. It is involved in certain reflexes in response to visual or auditory stimuli. Input from the tectum travels both rostrally and caudally via the reticulospinal tract, which also exerts some control over alertness. The corpora quadrigemina forms molds called colliculi in two pairs, superior colliculi and inferior colliculi. The superior colliculi processes some visual information and decussation of several fibers of the optic nerve and are involved in saccadic eye movements. There is also the tectospinal tract that connects the superior colliculi to cervical nerves of the neck and coordinates head and eye movements. The inferior colliculi, located just above trochlear nerve, and processes certain auditory information. The cerebral aqueduct, which is also part of the ventricular system that links the third ventricle with the fourth ventricle and is responsible for continuing the circulation of a cerebrospinal fluid. It is surrounded by the periaqueductal grid, which has a role in analgesia, quiescence, and bonding. The dorsal raphe nucleus, which releases serotonin in response to certain neural activity. The tegmentum, portion of the midbrain ventral to cerebral aqueduct, and is much larger in size than the tectum, communicates with the cerebellum by superior cerebellar peduncles. The main bulk of a tegmentum contains a complex synaptic network of neurons primarily involved in homeostasis and reflex action, and a number of distinct nerve tracts between other parts of the brain pass through. The area between the red nuclei of the ventral side, called the ventrotegmental area, is the largest dopamine-producing area in the brain and is heavily involved in neural reward system. And the ventrotegmental area is in contact with the parts of the forebrain. Cerebral peduncles, they form a lobe ventrally of the tegmentum on either sides of the midline. Beyond the midbrain, between the lobes, is the interpeduncular fossa, which is a cistern filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Majority of each lobe constitutes the cerebral crus. The cerebral crus are the main tracts descending from the thalamus to caudal parts of the central nervous system. The central and the medial ventral portions contain the corticobulbar and corticospinal tracts, while the remainder of each crus primarily contains tracts connecting the cortex to the pons. The portion of the lobes in connection with the tegmentum, except the most lateral portion, is dominated by a blackened band. The substantia nigra, also called the black substance, is the only part of the basal ganglia system out of the forebrain. It is involved in motor planning, learning, addiction, and other functions. The pons in the brainstem lies between the medulla oblongata and the midbrain, separated from the midbrain by the superior pontine sulcus, and forms the medulla by the inferior pontine sulcus. Contains tracts carrying signals from the cerebrum to the medulla and to the cerebellum, and also tracts carrying sensory signals to the thalamus. The pons is connected to the cerebellum by the cerebellar peduncles, houses the respiratory, pneumotaxic center, and aponeuristic center. The medulla oblongata, the point where the brainstem connects to the spinal cord, contains nucleus called the nucleus of the solitary tract that is crucial for our survival, receives information about blood flow, along with information about levels of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood from the heart and major blood vessels. When this information suggests discordance with bodily needs, for example, blood pressure is too low, there are reflexive actions initiated in the nucleus of the solitary tract to bring things back to within the desired range. Essential to our survival because it ensures that a vital system, for example, cardiovascular and respiratory systems, are working properly. The medulla contains cardiac, dorsal, and ventral respiratory groups and vasomotor centers dealing with heart rate, breathing, and blood pressure. Another important medullary structure is the area postroma, whose functions include the control of vomiting. Let's dig deeper and see more functions of the brain and more structures of the brain. The brain is divided into right and left brain and are joined by the corpus callosum that transmit messages from one side to the other. Each hemisphere controls the opposite side of the body. We call this decussation. Not all functions of the hemisphere are shared. In general, the left hemisphere controls speech comprehension, arithmetic, and writing. The right side controls creativity, spatial ability, artistic, and musical skills. The left hemisphere is dominant in hand use and language in about 92% of people. Hence, it is called the dominant hemisphere. In about a third of the people who are left-handed, speech function may be located in the right side, so they may need special testing to determine if the speech center is on the left or right side prior to any surgery in that area. Disruption of language or disturbance is called aphasia, and the type of aphasia depends on the area affected. Let's look at these important areas. The Broca's area located in the left frontal lobe. Damage to this area may lead to Broca's aphasia, may be characterized by difficulty in moving the tongue or facial muscles, to produce sounds of speech. The person can read, understand spoken language, but difficulty in speaking and writing. Another important area that lies in the left temporal lobe is the Wernicke's area. Damage to this area causes a Wernicke's aphasia. The person may make speech in long sentences that have no meaning and unnecessary words. They can make speech sounds, however, they have difficulties in understanding speech and are therefore unaware of their mistakes. The cortex of the brain. This is the surface of the brain folded. The peak is called gyrus or gyri in plural, and the trough is called sulcus or sulci in plural, and the process is called gyrification. The cortex contains 16 billion neurons that are arranged in specific layers. The cortex is the ultimate control and information processing center in the brain. It is responsible for functions such as sensation, perception, memory, association, thought, and voluntary physical action. The nerve cell colors the cortex gray-brown, giving its name the gray matter. Beneath the cortex are long nerve fibers called axons that connect the brain areas to each other, called white matter. The folding of the cortex increases the brain surface area, allowing more neurons to sit inside the skull and enabling higher function. Deeper structures of the brain. Pathways called wide matter tracts connect areas of the cortex to each other. Messages can travel from one gyrus to another, from one lobe to another, and to structures deeper in the brain. Let's begin with the hypothalamus, located in the floor of the third ventricle and is the master control of the autonomic nervous system. It's the gland in your brain that controls your hormone system. It releases hormones to another part of your brain called the pituitary gland, which sends the hormones out of your brain to different organs to regulate various homeostatic functions, plays a role in controlling behaviors such as hunger, thirst, sleep, and sexual response. It also regulates body temperature, blood pressure, and emotions, plus secretions of hormones, which we had earlier mentioned. Some of these hormones include corticotropin-releasing hormone, dopamine, growth hormone-releasing hormone, somatostatin, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and thyrotropin-releasing hormone. Let's look at the pituitary gland. Lies in a small pocket of the bone at the skull base called the sella tussica. It's connected to the hypothalamus by pituitary stalk. Because it controls other endocrine glands in the body, it's known as the master gland. It secretes hormones that control sexual development, promotes bone and muscle growth, and respond to stress. The pituitary has two main parts, the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. The anterior pituitary gland, also called the adenohypophysis, releases hormones upon releasing or inhibiting hormones from the hypothalamus. These hypothalamic hormones tell the anterior lobe whether to release more or specific hormone or stop production of the hormone. Anterior lobe hormones include adrenocorticotropic hormone, abbreviated as ACTH, which stimulates the adrenal glands to release hormones, follicle-stimulating hormones, which work with the luteinizing hormone to ensure normal functioning of the ovaries and testes, growth hormones, abbreviated as GH, essential in early years to maintaining a healthy body composition and for growing in children. In adults, it aids healthy bones and muscle mass and affects fat distribution. Luteinizing hormone, abbreviated as LH, work with the follicle-stimulating hormone to ensure normal functioning of the ovaries and testes. Prolactin stimulates milk production. Thyroid-stimulating hormone, TSH, stimulates thyroid gland to produce hormones. The posterior lobe, also called the neurohypophysis, contains the ends of the nerve cell communicating from the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sends hormones directly to the posterior lobe via the nerves, and then pituitary gland releases them. Posterior lobe hormones include antidiuretic hormones, abbreviated as ADH, which prompts the kidneys to increase water absorption in the blood. Oxytocin, involved in various processes such as contracting the uterus during childbirth and stimulating production of breast milk. The thalamus serves as a relay center for information that comes and goes to the cortex. It plays a role in pain sensation, attention, alertness, and memory. The basal ganglia includes the caudate putamen and the globus pallidus. This nuclei works with the cerebellum to coordinate fine motions such as fingertip movements. Limbic system, center for emotions, learning, and memory. Included in this system are cingulate gyri, hypothalamus, amygdala, which is responsible for emotional reactions, and hypothalamus for memory. Memory is included in three phases: encoding, which is deciding what information is important; storing and recalling, There are different types of memory, so your brain has to pay attention and rehearse in order for an event to move from a short-term to long-term memory, which we call encoding. Short-term memory, also called a working memory, occurs in the prefrontal cortex, stores information for about 1 minute, and its capacity is limited to about 7 items. For example, it enables you to dial a phone number someone just told you. It also intervenes during reading to memorize the sentence you just read so that the next one makes sense. Long-term memory is processed in the hippocampus of the temporal lobe and is activated when you want to memorize something for a longer time. This memory has unlimited content and duration capacity. Skill memory is processed in the cerebellum, which relays information to the basal ganglia. It stores automatic learned memories like tying a shoe, playing an instrument, and riding a bike. The brain has a hollow fluid-filled cavities called ventricles. Inside the ventricles is a ribbon-like structure, colloid plexus, that makes cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid helps cushion the brain from injury. There are 2 ventricles deep in the cerebral hemisphere called the lateral ventricles. They both connect with the 3rd ventricle through an opening called foramen of Monroe. The 3rd ventricle connects to the 4th through a long narrow tube called the aqueduct of Sylvius. From the 4th ventricle, cerebrospinal fluid flows into the subarachnoid space, where it bathes and cushions the brain. Let's look at the skull. Serves to protect the brain from injury, formed from 8 bones that fuse together along suture lines. These are frontal, parietal, temporal, sphenoid, occipital, and ethmoid bones. There are also cranial nerves that, along with the spinal cord, the brain communicates with the body. There are 12 in pairs. 10 of the 12 pairs of cranial nerves that control hearing, eye movement, facial sensation, taste, swallowing, and movement of face, neck, shoulder, and tongue muscles originate from the brainstem. Ones responsible for smell and vision originate in the cerebrum. These nerves are olfactory, which is cranial nerve number 1, responsible for smell. Optic nerve, cranial nerve number 2 for sight. Oculomotor, cranial nerve number 3, moves the eye and the pupil. And then trochlear nerve, which is cranial nerve number 4, moves the eye. Cranial nerve number 5, the trigeminal nerve, responsible for face sensation. Cranial nerve number 6, abducens, moves the eye. Cranial nerve number 7, the facial nerve, moves the face and responsible for salivation. Cranial nerve number 8, vestibulocochlear nerve, responsible for hearing and balance. Cranial nerve number 9, glossopharyngeal, responsible for taste and swallowing. Cranial nerve number 10, which is the vagus, responsible for heart rate and digestion. Cranial nerve number 11, the accessory nerve, moves the head. And then lastly, cranial nerve number 12, hypoglossal nerve, which moves the tongue. Let's look at the meninges. The brain and the spinal cord are covered and protected by 3 layers of the tissue, which are called meninges. These layers are the pia mater, which hugs the surface of the brain following its folds and grooves. It has many blood vessels that reach deep into the brain. The space between the pia mater and the next layer, called the arachnoid mater, is called the subarachnoid space. It is where the cerebrospinal fluid bathes and cushions the brain. Arachnoid mater is the 2nd layer, thin web-like membrane that covers the entire brain. The arachnoid is made up of elastic tissue. The space between the arachnoid mater and the next level, called the dura mater, is called space. Then lastly, we have the dura mater. It's a strong, thick membrane that closely lines the inside of the skull. Its 2 layers, the peristyle and the meningeal dura, are fused and separated only to form venous sinuses. The dura creates little folds or compartments. These are 2 special dural folds, the falx and the tentorium. The falx separates the right and the left hemispheres of the brain, and the tentorium separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. We also have blood vessels that supply the brain tissue with oxygen and nutrients, and also carry away waste products from the brain tissues. So this sophisticated organ has many structures, and we cannot finish talking about them. So these are the main structures that we have just